On March 6, 2024, a peaceful Ottawa suburb became the scene of unimaginable horror. A trusted family guest turned into a killer, leaving 6 innocent lives lost. What drove this senseless act? Stay with us as we uncover the chilling details of the Barrhaven mass murder. Barrhaven, a quiet suburb of Ottawa, was the kind of place families chose when they wanted peace, safety, and community. Tree-lined streets curved into cul-de-sacs filled with modest townhouses. Playgrounds echoed with children's laughter, and neighbors waved as they passed each other on evening walks. To most, it felt far removed from the chaos and violence of the outside world. For the Wickramasinghe family, who had arrived in Canada from Sri Lanka, Barrhaven was not just a place to live. It was a symbol of a new beginning, a chance to raise their children in an environment filled with opportunity and promise. Darshani Wickramasinghe, only 35, carried the spirit of hope with her every day. She had grown up in Sri Lanka, where challenges were plenty, but she dreamed of giving her children a life free from struggle. In Canada, she worked hard, balancing the exhausting demands of raising 4 children with the commitment to make their home feel secure and filled with love. Her husband, Dushmantha, shared the same vision. Together, they worked tirelessly, often sacrificing personal comfort so their children could have a future that looked brighter than their own past. Their children were the heart of the household. Kelly, the eldest at 7 years old, was known for her protective nature. Teachers described her as a bright, focused student who often looked after her younger siblings even in class, making sure they were safe, fed, and smiling. 4-year-old Brian was different in temperament, playful, high-spirited, with a smile that could light up a room. He was constantly moving, constantly curious. 2-year-old Samantha was the shadow of her mother, following Darshani from room to room, babbling with curiosity and eager to be part of every moment. And then there was Benjamin, only 2 months old, so tiny and fragile that he barely understood the world into which he had been born. He was a symbol of new beginnings, of fresh hope for the family's journey in Canada. Within the walls of their Barrhaven home, life felt simple and warm. Neighbors often saw Darshani walking the children to the park, sometimes pushing the stroller with Benjamin, while Kelly held on to her younger brother's hand. The children laughed together, played together, and gave the impression of a household bound tightly by love and routine. When friends visited, they were welcomed with hospitality rooted in Sri Lankan tradition. Tea on the table, food shared generously, and conversations that carried on into the night. It was in this home that 19-year-old Fabio de Zoysa had been living. He, too, was from Sri Lanka, but unlike the Wickramasinghe family, he was here as an international student, trying to build his own life abroad. To the family, he was not just a guest. He was treated almost like a relative. He shared meals with them, sat at the same table, and was offered the kind of trust extended only to someone you believe carries no threat. For months, he lived among them, becoming familiar with the rhythms of the house. The children's laughter, the parents' struggles, the quiet evenings when the family settled in together. To outsiders, nothing seemed unusual about his presence. Families in immigrant communities often supported each other this way, opening their homes, sharing their resources, and offering companionship in a foreign land. For Darshani and Dushmantha, letting Fabio stay was an extension of their kindness. They believed they were helping a young man find his footing in Canada, just as they themselves had once been helped by others. In return, they expected nothing more than respect, gratitude, and peace. March 6, 2024, began like any other day. The streets of Barrhaven bustled quietly with children walking home from school, parents returning from work, and families preparing their evening routines. Inside the Wickramasinghe home, the atmosphere was no different. Homework was likely being finished at the table, dinner was being prepared, and the younger children played in their usual cheerful way. Nothing hinted at the storm that was about to break. Friends and neighbors would later recall that they had seen the family earlier that day, smiling as always, completely unaware of what was coming. There were no warnings, no signs of danger, no outward tensions between the family and the young man living with them. The house, with its modest exterior and welcoming atmosphere, gave no clue that within hours it would become the scene of one of the most shocking crimes in Ottawa's history. For the Wickramasinghe family, Canada represented everything they had hoped for, a life without fear, without the struggles that had once surrounded them. They were ordinary people living extraordinary dreams, parents raising children who would one day contribute to the country they now called home. Their friends described them as warm, generous, and determined. The children were described as vibrant and full of potential. And Febrio, though less known to neighbors, was thought to be nothing more than another young man trying to adjust to life far from home. But beneath the calm, something dark was taking shape, something even those closest to him could not have anticipated. In the months that Febrio lived with the family, there had been no major reports of conflict, no outbursts that suggested the violence he would unleash. And yet, on that March evening, the trust given to him, the safety of the family, and the promise of their future would be destroyed in a matter of minutes. As the sun set over Barrhaven, the neighborhood was quiet, families locked their doors, and the Wickramasinghe family carried on with their nightly routine. Kelly might have been preparing for school the next day, Brian perhaps playing with his toys, Samantha clinging to her mother, and baby Benjamin resting peacefully in his crib. For them, it was another ordinary evening in the home they believed was safe. But safety in that moment was only an illusion. The danger was not outside their front door. It was already inside their walls, and it came from someone they trusted. When night fell, Barrhaven remained calm, unaware of the horror about to unfold in one of its homes. What happened next would not only shatter a single family, but would ripple across the entire community, leaving scars that could never be healed. It would mark March 6, 2024, as the night innocence was brutally stolen from a family who had come to Canada only seeking peace. Night settled over Barrhaven like a blanket, calm and uneventful. In most homes, families were gathered for dinner, children tucked into their routines, and parents winding down after a long day. Inside the Wickramasinghe residence, the evening unfolded in familiar patterns. Laughter from the children, conversations drifting through the rooms, and the comforting hum of domestic life. But just beyond the walls of routine, something darker began to stir. At approximately the same time that neighbors were switching off their porch lights, 19-year-old Febrio de Zoysa was moving through the house. He had been with the family for months, trusted enough to live under their roof, fed at their table, and included in their daily lives. On that night, however, his thoughts turned violent. Police would later describe the attack as sudden and senseless, an eruption of brutality without clear warning. But within those walls, the betrayal was personal, intimate, and devastating. The exact sequence of events inside the house will never be fully known, but investigators pieced together fragments from the evidence left behind. What is certain is that Febrio armed himself with a knife. The first to face him was likely Darshani Wickramasinghe, the mother who was central to the household. She may have been preparing dinner or attending to her youngest child when the violence erupted. In that moment, trust turned into horror. The woman who had welcomed him, who had treated him like family, suddenly found herself fighting for her life against the young man she had once sheltered. Her screams, neighbors later said, were muffled. Some recalled hearing unusual noises, but in a busy neighborhood, odd sounds often go unnoticed. Within the home, however, chaos had already descended. The children, startled and frightened, would have been caught in the terror almost instantly. Kelly, the eldest at 7, may have tried to shield her siblings, just as she always had. Brian, only 4, too young to understand, likely stood frozen in confusion before the attack reached him. Samantha, the toddler who clung to her mother, would have been defenseless, her small world ending in incomprehensible violence. Baby Benjamin, still in his crib, never had a chance. As the killings unfolded, another figure in the house, 40-year-old family friend Nimal Jayawardena, became a victim. He had been staying with the Wickramasinghes for a short time, a trusted guest welcomed into their home. That night, he too faced the same violent fate. Police later identified him among the dead, stabbed like the others, caught in the storm that no one could have foreseen. The attack was merciless and swift. 6 lives extinguished in minutes. The quiet domestic setting, once filled with laughter and warmth, became a scene of devastation. When police eventually entered, they would describe what they found as one of the most horrifying sights imaginable. Meanwhile, the one person who might have stopped it, the father, Dushmantha Wickramasinghe, was not home. Fate had placed him elsewhere during the killings. When he finally returned later that night, what he walked into defied comprehension. Behind the front door of his family home was silence where there should have been laughter, darkness where there should have been light. What he discovered inside was beyond the capacity of a husband and father to bear. His wife, his 4 children, and his friend, all brutally murdered. The details of his reaction remain private, out of respect for his grief, but first responders described a man broken in an instant. His entire world, built carefully over years of sacrifice and hope, had collapsed within a single night. Police officers, hardened by years of service, admitted that what they saw inside that home would haunt them forever. When authorities arrived, Fabio was still there. Unlike most violent perpetrators, he did not flee. He was arrested without resistance, calm amid the devastation he had caused. Investigators secured the home and confirmed quickly that there were no other suspects, no signs of forced entry, and no indication that anyone outside the household was involved. The conclusion was devastating. This massacre had come from within, carried out by the very person welcomed into the family's life. As news of the crime spread, disbelief echoed through the community. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the ordinary family they had known with the unimaginable violence that had unfolded inside their home. Some described seeing the children playing outside just days earlier. Others remembered Darshani's kindness and her ever-present smile. Now, those memories were replaced by images of police cars, flashing lights, and a house sealed off by crime scene tape. Investigators combed through every detail. They searched for motive, for history, for any sign that might explain what had happened. But what they found was silence. Fabio offered no immediate explanation. There was no evidence of robbery, no indication of long-term disputes, no hidden secrets that pointed toward such an outcome. Police Chief Eric Stubbs later called it a crime without reason, a senseless act of violence that defied logic. The Wickramasinghe family had once believed their home was a safe haven, a place where their children could grow up shielded from the dangers they had left behind in another country. That night, the illusion of safety was shattered. The danger had not come from the outside world. It had lived quietly within their walls, disguised as a trusted friend. As the police investigation expanded, forensic teams documented every corner of the house, gathering evidence that would eventually be presented in court. The neighborhood remained eerily quiet in the days that followed, the house standing as a grim reminder of what had occurred. Flowers and candles began to appear outside, left by neighbors and strangers alike, tokens of grief for lives taken too soon. Inside the police station, Fabio sat in custody. 19 years old, barely an adult, he had destroyed an entire family. His youth made the crime even harder to comprehend. How could someone so young commit such calculated brutality? Why had he turned on the people who had given him shelter? Those questions circled endlessly, unanswered, as investigators prepared charges. For Dushmantha, the father left behind, the days after the killings blurred into grief and disbelief. He had gone from being a father of 4 to being alone in a matter of hours. His pain was not only personal but deeply public, his tragedy unfolding under the gaze of media cameras and headlines. Yet, in the midst of unimaginable loss, he carried himself with dignity, speaking only briefly to express his sorrow and his gratitude for the support from the community. By the time the night of March 6th ended, Ottawa had changed. The image of Barrhaven as a quiet, safe suburb was shaken. The Wickramasinghe home, once filled with life, was now a crime scene, and a young man who had been trusted as family was behind bars, accused of one of the worst mass killings the city had ever witnessed. The murders left not only a devastated father, but an entire community struggling to understand how such violence could erupt in the heart of a family home. The answers would not come quickly. They may never come at all. But the impact of that night would ripple outward, far beyond Barrhaven, leaving scars that time alone could not heal. In the days that followed the massacre, the city of Ottawa was in shock. News of the killings spread quickly across Canada, with headlines capturing the horror of 6 lives lost in a single night. The names of the victims, Darshani, Kelly, Brian, Samantha, Benjamin, and Naimal, were spoken with sorrow at vigils, in places of worship, and in homes across the Sri Lankan diaspora. For many, it was difficult to comprehend how such violence could strike in the heart of a neighborhood like Barhaven, where families moved for peace and safety. For others, it was impossible to understand how a young man, only 19, could carry out such brutality against people who had welcomed him as one of their own. The Wickramasinghe home became a place of mourning. Outside, flowers piled up on the front steps, stuffed animals, notes written by children, and candles were left by neighbors and strangers alike. Some who had never met the family felt compelled to visit, to pay respects, to show solidarity in the face of an act that seemed to defy humanity itself. At night, the glow of candles lit up the street, a quiet reminder of the lives stolen inside that house. Community leaders stepped forward, offering comfort and organizing memorials. The Sri Lankan community, both in Ottawa and across Canada, grieved as though they had lost members of their own families. For immigrants who had come to this country in search of stability and safety, the killings struck a particularly painful chord. These were people who had left behind struggles in their homeland only to face unimaginable violence in the place they believed would protect them. Political leaders addressed the tragedy as well. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau extended condolences on behalf of the nation, acknowledging the depth of the loss and the grief that had spread far beyond the boundaries of Ottawa. Local officials visited the site of the killings, speaking to neighbors and offering support to the Sri Lankan Canadian community. But despite words of sympathy and gestures of solidarity, nothing could mend the grief of the one man who had lost everything. For Dushmantha Wickramasinghe, the father and husband who had been away from home at the time of the murders, the days after were unbearable. He was thrust into the center of media attention, his pain broadcast to the world. He had to face the grim duty of identifying the bodies of his wife, his children, and his friend. In the space of a single evening, his entire world had collapsed. Those who saw him described a man carrying the weight of a grief so heavy it seemed impossible to survive. And yet, he stood in the midst of it, broken but enduring, a silent witness to the cruelty of what had been done to his family. The legal process began almost immediately. Fabio de Zoysa, arrested at the scene without resistance, faced charges of first-degree murder. In court appearances, he remained silent, offering no explanation for his actions. His youth only deepened the mystery. What could drive someone so young, someone given shelter and care, to commit such violence? Investigators found no clear motive. There were no signs of robbery, no evidence of long-standing conflict, and no indications of mental breakdown that could fully account for the killings. The police chief called it a senseless act, and those words echoed again and again in media coverage. The lack of answers compounded the grief. For the community, it was not only the loss of life but the absence of understanding that made the tragedy unbearable. As weeks turned into months, the memory of the Barhaven killings remained raw. At memorial services, photographs of the victims were displayed: Darshani's warm smile, Kelly's school portraits, Brian's playful grin, Samantha's bright eyes, and baby Benjamin's tiny face. Each image told a story of lives that should have been long, futures that should have stretched ahead for decades. Naimal, the family friend, was remembered for his kindness and generosity. The services were filled with weeping mourners, voices choked by sorrow, and prayers offered in multiple languages. In every corner of the room, grief was palpable. For neighbors, life on Berrigan Drive changed forever. Passing by the Wickramasinghe house became a haunting experience. The memory of flashing police lights burned into their minds. The sight of children playing on the street now carried an undertone of fragility, a reminder that safety could be shattered in an instant. Parents held their children closer, neighbors checked on one another more often, and the sense of innocence once tied to their community was gone. In Sri Lanka, the news traveled quickly, striking the Wickramasinghe and Jayawardena families thousands of miles away. Relatives who had hoped their loved ones would thrive in Canada were instead faced with the unbearable reality that they would be returning home in coffins. The shock and grief extended far beyond Ottawa, touching a global community that mourned 6 innocent lives taken without reason. The legal proceedings dragged on, as criminal cases often do. Each court date brought the story back into the public eye, reopening wounds for those who had tried to move forward. Reporters wrote about the father's quiet presence in the courtroom, about the accused sitting silently, about the absence of answers. For the community, the question of why remained as heavy as the loss itself. Without motive, the killings felt even more senseless, as though the very concept of trust had been betrayed in its purest form. The tragedy also sparked conversations about the challenges of immigrant life, about the vulnerabilities families face when they extend trust, and about the hidden dangers that can sometimes lurk even in the safest-seeming environments. But in the end, no analysis, no discussion, could explain away the horror of that night. For most, the only truth that mattered was the simple one. A family was gone, and nothing could bring them back. Years from now, March 6, 2024, will still be remembered in Ottawa as the night when Barrhaven's sense of safety was shattered. The Wickramasinghe family's story will continue to be told, not only as a tragedy but as a reminder of the fragility of life and the weight of trust. The candles that once lit the street outside their home may have burned out, but the memory of those who placed them there remains, carried in the hearts of a community forever changed. For Dushmantha, the final chapter is not written. His life continues, though burdened with loss that can never be repaired. He carries the memory of his wife's kindness, his children's laughter, and his friends' companionship. His grief is a permanent shadow, a reminder of what was taken from him in a single night. He is both a survivor and a witness, the only one left to carry their story. The Barrhaven mass murder is remembered not only for its brutality but for its senselessness. It stands as one of Ottawa's darkest tragedies, a crime that left behind shattered lives, unanswered questions, and a community bound together in grief. And as time moves forward, the silence of that unanswered why continues to echo, haunting all who remember the night when trust turned to betrayal, and hope was stolen from a family who had only ever wanted peace. On the morning of July 29, 2024, Southport. On a quiet summer morning in Southport, a children's dance workshop turned into a nightmare no one could have imagined. 3 young lives were stolen, many others scarred forever, and a nation left asking why. This is the chilling story behind Britain's most shocking 2024 tragedy. Was alive with the gentle rhythm of a seaside town in summer. The streets carried the easy sounds of families heading to the shops, the laughter of children out of school for the holidays, and the smell of warm bread wafting from local cafes. It was a town known more for its piers and family attractions than for tragedy. At the heart of this calm, inside a modest building known as the Heart Space, a group of young children were buzzing with excitement. The day promised music, dancing, and games in a Taylor Swift-themed workshop. For the children, most between the ages of 6 and 10, it was a chance to lose themselves in pop melodies, dress-up fun, and the infectious energy of a star they idolized. Parents had trusted that space as safe, warm, and nurturing, a place where innocence was protected. No one could have imagined how quickly that trust would be shattered. The event had been arranged by 2 local instructors, both well-loved by parents who admired their passion for working with children. The room upstairs was decorated with simple, cheerful touches. Song lyrics on posters, colorful mats for yoga stretches, and a speaker ready to play upbeat tracks. The air was filled with chatter as the girls compared favorite songs, some clutching glittery outfits or dance props they had begged their parents to buy. To anyone watching, it was a picture of joy and community. But beyond those walls, another figure was moving quietly toward them. 17-year-old Axel Muganwa Rudakabana stepped out of a taxi a few streets away. He wore a green hoodie, hood pulled low, and a mask obscuring his face. To the casual observer, he might have seemed like any teenager heading to a rehearsal or perhaps meeting friends. Yet hidden within his clothing was a weapon, a large kitchen knife, its blade long and sharp, bought weeks earlier with chilling foresight. He had concealed it with care, waiting for a moment when its presence would matter most. That moment had come. The dance studio's door had been left unlocked, a standard practice to comply with fire safety rules. It was a detail no one thought twice about until that day. Rutacabana slipped inside without resistance, his steps deliberate, his mind focused. Upstairs, the children laughed, unaware of the danger about to engulf them. The instructors, immersed in their lesson plan, continued their work, encouraging the children to stretch and dance. Nothing seemed unusual, nothing gave warning. Yet within seconds, the ordinary morning would transform into one of Britain's darkest days in recent memory. Documentaries often capture the suddenness of tragedy, the moment when peace gives way to chaos, when lives are split between before and after. Southport would remember this day in exactly that way. Witnesses later recalled how the first screams were high-pitched and sharp, the kind that carried panic even before anyone understood why. The sound of running feet, the crash of a chair, the sudden break in the music, all these blended into confusion. And then came the realization. Someone was attacking the children. The instructors reacted instinctively. One of them, Leanne Lucas, turned immediately toward the source of danger. She saw the glint of steel, the deliberate movements of a teenager whose face was obscured, and the panic spreading across the faces of the children she had promised to protect. Without hesitation, she placed herself between attacker and students. She felt the first stab before she could even cry out, the shock of pain spreading across her back, but she did not stop. She shouted at the children to run, ushering them toward the fire exit, her own body serving as both shield and barrier. At the same time, her colleague, Heidi Little, reacted with equal determination. She grabbed the nearest children, pushing them toward corners, searching desperately for places to hide. In one frantic moment, she forced a little girl into a bathroom, closing the door quickly, praying the attacker wouldn't look inside. In their hearts, both women must have known the odds they faced, yet neither considered stepping back. Their only thought was to save as many children as possible. Downstairs, the noise carried beyond the studio. In a neighboring unit, businessman Jonathan Hayes heard the sounds of panic. Without hesitation, he rushed upstairs, unarmed, with no thought of his own safety. He found himself face to face with the chaos. The masked teenager, the knife already stained, children crying and stumbling over each other. Hayes tried to intervene to draw attention away from the children, but he too became a target. The blade pierced his leg, dropping him to the ground in pain. Yet even as he fell, his action had bought precious seconds for others to escape. For the children, the experience was a blur of terror. Some were herded toward the exit by Lucas, their small legs stumbling down the stairs. Others crouched behind furniture, too afraid to move, their ears ringing with screams and the sound of chaos. Survivors would later describe images burned into memory. The flash of a blade, the cries of friends, the desperate shouts of their teachers. For many, childhood ended in those minutes. When police arrived, they entered a scene that was both frenzied and eerily still. The attacker was subdued quickly, taken into custody without further fight. But the damage had already been done. In that studio, 3 children lay fatally wounded, their young lives cut short in a place that should have been their sanctuary. Others were bleeding, their injuries severe. Adults who had stood in harm's way were collapsed, clinging to consciousness. The walls that had echoed with laughter now bore the imprint of terror. Word spread rapidly across Southport. Parents who had left their children only minutes earlier rushed back, hearts pounding, desperate for news. Streets filled with emergency vehicles, their sirens slicing through the summer air. Some parents arrived to find their children safe but trembling. Others faced the unimaginable, the cold confirmation that their child would not be coming home. Communities often speak of collective trauma, but in Southport, that phrase became more than words. It was lived in the tears, the shock, and the silence that followed. As with all tragedies, questions emerged almost immediately. Who was this attacker? Why had he chosen children? What darkness had driven a teenager to commit such an act? Police worked swiftly, piecing together fragments of his life, uncovering disturbing details that hinted at long-simmering danger. The revelations would stun not only Southport but the entire nation. Yet in the first hours after the attack, before those answers came, the focus was only on loss, on the raw grief that weighed heavily in every corner of the town. In documentary storytelling, it is often said that the most haunting aspect of violence is its intrusion into places of innocence. A classroom, a church, a playground, a dance studio, each designed for safety, each shattered in an instant. For Southport, the heart space would forever carry that shadow. The cheerful posters, the mats, the music equipment, all became artifacts of a day when safety collapsed. The attack lasted only minutes, yet its echoes stretched endlessly. Survivors left with physical scars, children traumatized by what they had seen, families broken by unbearable loss. All became part of the story. And though the attacker was quickly arrested, the deeper questions had only begun to surface. What had led him there? Could it have been stopped? And how could a community ever heal from something so senseless? As part 1 closes, the scene is set. A seaside town plunged into grief, a crime that defied comprehension, and an attacker whose motives were as chilling as they were unclear. The answers would unfold in the investigation, the trial, and the revelations of a troubled past. But for now, the focus remained on those first harrowing moments, when the ordinary turned to horror, and Southport's innocence was stolen in a storm of violence. In the hours after the attack, Southport seemed to exist in 2 parallel realities. On one side were the ordinary rhythms of a summer afternoon, the hum of traffic, the chatter of beachgoers unaware of what had unfolded only a few streets away. On the other side was a town gripped by shock, its center transformed into a zone of sirens, cordons, and flashing blue lights. Parents clutched their children in the street, some weeping openly, others too numb to speak. Ambulances ferried the wounded to hospitals in Liverpool and Manchester, their journeys accompanied by a silence broken only by sobbing relatives. For those whose children did not return, the world had suddenly become unrecognizable. 3 young lives had been extinguished, and their absence would ripple through homes, schools, and communities for years to come. The police worked methodically, first securing the building and tending to survivors, then piecing together the sequence of events. Officers spoke to the instructors, their words halting as they recounted how they had tried to protect the children. They listened to Jonathan Hayes, pale from blood loss yet insistent on explaining how he had intervened. Most haunting were the statements from the children themselves. Fragmented accounts of screams, of hiding in bathrooms, of seeing friends collapse. These testimonies, though difficult to hear, were vital in understanding the sheer speed and brutality of the attack. Meanwhile, the attacker sat in custody, silent and withdrawn. Axel Muganwa Rutacabana was only 17, but his actions carried the weight of someone far older, calculated and unflinching. Detectives combed through his belongings, searching for clues. His phone and laptop told a story far more chilling than anyone anticipated. Downloads of extremist manuals, files about warfare and genocide, and evidence of attempts to experiment with toxins filled the screen. Investigators quickly realized this was not an impulsive act. It was the culmination of months, even years of obsession. Yet still the question lingered: why target children? What possible ideology or grievance could lead to such a choice? As the community held vigils, the identities of the victims emerged. 6-year-old B.B. King, remembered for her boundless energy and mischievous grin, had been the youngest. 7-year-old Elsie Stankham, who loved music and animals, was described by her teachers as a child who brought light to every room. 9-year-old Alice da Silva Aguiar, born to Brazilian parents, was a gifted dancer with dreams of performing on stage one day. Their names, once just those of schoolchildren, became symbols of a tragedy that touched the entire nation. Photographs of their smiling faces appeared on front pages, juxtaposed against the grim image of the crime scene. Each story deepened the grief, making clear the scale of what had been lost. In the days that followed, the narrative broadened. Journalists uncovered that Rutacabana had long been on the radar of authorities. Teachers had reported his troubling behavior, his fixation with violence, his talk of knives, his disturbing comments about conflict. He had been referred 3 separate times to the government's Prevent program, designed to identify individuals vulnerable to extremism. Yet each referral had been closed, deemed low risk. His school had once found him with knives in his bag. He had expressed fantasies of violence. But at every turn, interventions seemed to stop short, opportunities to act slipping away. For the families grieving in Southport, these revelations were unbearable. The attack had not come out of nowhere. The signs had been there all along. The investigation also revealed his methodical planning. He had purchased the knife online, timing the delivery to avoid suspicion. He had chosen the Taylor Swift workshop deliberately, seeing it as a gathering of children vulnerable and unprotected. He had booked a taxi under a false name, ensuring he arrived without trace. Each step pointed to intent, to a decision not just to kill but to inflict maximum horror. In the cold language of law, this was premeditation of the highest order. In the raw language of the families, it was cruelty beyond comprehension. Documentary storytelling thrives on contrasts, and here the contrast was stark. On one side was the ordinariness of Southport, seaside amusements, small businesses, schools preparing for autumn. On the other was the darkness within a teenager who had lived among them, whose neighbors might have seen him walking down the street without ever suspecting the violence he was planning. The dissonance between those two realities became the heart of the narrative. How could someone so young, raised in the same town, nurtured by the same schools, diverge so drastically into violence? As police pieced together his history, the portrait that emerged was of a boy adrift. Born in Cardiff to Rwandan parents, he grew up with access to opportunities but also with signs of deep instability. He joined drama clubs, took part in performances, but behind the curtain lurked darker interests. Friends recalled how he spoke of war and massacres with unsettling fascination. Online, he buried himself in extremist forums and violent imagery. At school, his behavior triggered alarms, but each time systems designed to protect him and others seemed to falter. By the time he entered the heart space on that July morning, the path had been set. For Southport, the aftermath became a time of reckoning. The community organized vigils, laying flowers outside the studio, lighting candles that flickered late into the night. Strangers embraced in the streets, united by grief. Parents spoke openly about the fear of letting their children out of sight. The attack had punctured the illusion of safety that every community clings to. Teachers asked themselves whether enough had been done to spot warning signs. Officials faced questions about the effectiveness of Prevent, about how a teenager so clearly troubled could slip through the cracks. The funerals of the 3 children were heart-wrenching events that brought the nation's attention back to Southport. Tiny coffins carried by grieving families, hymns sung through tears, the sight of classmates clutching flowers. These images captured the innocents destroyed. Leaders spoke solemnly, promising inquiries, pledging support, yet no words could restore what had been lost. In homes across Britain, parents tucked their children into bed with an extra embrace, haunted by the realization that safety could never be guaranteed. Through it all, Rutacabana remained largely silent, his demeanor in custody described as cold and emotionless. Psychologists debated whether he was driven by ideology, mental illness, or a pure desire for notoriety. Prosecutors, however, focused only on the facts. A knife purchased, a workshop targeted, 3 lives taken, 10 more injured. The legal case built itself piece by piece until it became undeniable. Whatever his inner motives, his actions were deliberate and devastating. The weight of the attack reached far beyond Southport. Across the country, debates reignited about youth radicalization, about online extremism, about the failures of safeguarding systems. Could this attack have been stopped? Was it a failure of intelligence, of community, of communication? For many, the answers pointed to a painful truth. The danger signs had been visible, but the system had lacked the urgency to intervene. The children of Southport paid the price. As Part 2 draws to a close, the story shifts from the chaos of the day itself to the broader picture of a teenager whose path to violence had been paved with warning signs. The grief of families merged with public anger, and a demand for accountability began to rise. Ahead lay the courtroom, where the full weight of justice would confront the attacker, and where the stories of the victims and survivors would finally be heard in their raw, unfiltered truth. When the courtroom doors opened months later, the nation's eyes turned once more to Southport. The trial was not only a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning with the horror that had unfolded. Families of the victims sat in the public gallery, clutching photographs, tissues, and each other's hands for strength. Survivors, still bearing scars both visible and invisible, gathered with quiet dignity. In the dock sat Axel Mugenwa Rutacabana, the teenager whose actions had torn a community apart. He appeared calm, detached, offering little sign of remorse. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, as though every breath carried the weight of expectation, that justice, however imperfect, would at last be delivered. Prosecutors built their case with precision, laying out the sequence of events as if assembling a grim puzzle. They described how Rutacabana purchased his knife, how he planned his movements, and how he chose his target deliberately. They presented the digital trail he had left behind. Extremist documents, violent images, and chilling evidence of fascination with warfare and toxins. Each revelation drew gasps, each detail a reminder that this attack was not spontaneous but premeditated. Witnesses stepped forward, recounting in painstaking detail the minutes of terror inside the heart space. Some spoke through tears, others with steady determination, but all painted a picture of chaos, fear, and unimaginable loss. The defense, limited in what it could argue, focused on his age. At 17, they said, he was not fully formed, not entirely in control of his judgment. They hinted at psychological troubles, at confusion, at influences beyond his grasp. But the facts were overwhelming. The planning, the execution, the cold targeting of children all spoke of intent. For the families, no defense could soften the truth. Their children were gone, their lives shattered, and the attacker had acted with chilling clarity. Perhaps the most powerful moments came when the victims' families addressed the court. Parents spoke of empty bedrooms, of birthdays that would never be celebrated, of dreams stolen too soon. They described the sound of laughter that no longer echoed in their homes, the unbearable silence that replaced it. Siblings talked about missing playmates, about confusion and grief that no child should ever endure. These statements, raw and unfiltered, cut through the legal language and reminded everyone present that behind the case file were real lives, forever altered. When the judge finally delivered the sentence, the courtroom seemed to exhale as one. Rutacabana was handed life imprisonment with a minimum term of 52 years, effectively ensuring he would spend most, if not all, of his life behind bars. The judge's words were stark. This was an atrocity of the gravest kind, an act of cruelty beyond measure. For the families, the sentence was both a relief and a reminder. Justice had been served in legal terms, but nothing could return what had been lost. The wounds of July 29th would remain, etched into memory. Outside the court, reactions rippled across the country. Some saw the sentence as a warning, a message that such acts would be met with the harshest possible consequence. Others questioned how a teenager could descend to such darkness, and whether society had failed to intervene in time. Politicians called for inquiries into the PREVENT program, demanding to know why warning signs had been ignored. Experts debated the influence of online extremism, the role of mental health, and the challenges of predicting violence. Yet amid the noise, the voices that resonated most clearly were those of Southport's families, who asked only that their children be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. In the months after the sentencing, Southport began the slow process of healing. The heart space, once a symbol of terror, became a place of remembrance. Flowers, toys, and notes from strangers covered its steps. Vigils were held on anniversaries, candles flickering in the evening light as names were spoken aloud. The town rallied around the survivors, raising funds for medical care, offering counseling, and creating safe spaces for children still haunted by memories of that day. Schools introduced new safeguarding measures, determined never to overlook troubling behavior again. the survivors carried their own journeys forward. Some bore physical scars, reminders of how close they had come to death. Others struggled with nightmares, flinching at sudden noises, or avoiding crowded places. Yet many also displayed resilience beyond their years. With the support of teachers, therapists, and families, they slowly reclaimed parts of their childhood, step by fragile step. For the instructors who had stood in harm's way, their heroism was recognized nationally, though they themselves preferred to stay in the background, insisting they had done only what any adult would do. For the wider public, the Southport stabbings became a grim touchstone in debates about youth violence and radicalization. Documentaries were produced, experts interviewed, timelines dissected. The story was retold again and again, each time prompting the same questions. Could it have been stopped? And how can society prevent another tragedy? The answers were complex, but one truth was undeniable. The children of Southport had paid the price for collective failures. In the quiet moments, away from the cameras and inquiries, the reality remained stark. 3 families faced empty chairs at their tables. Birthdays arrived with no candles to blow out. Schools kept desks empty in tribute, their classmates writing messages in memory books that would be cherished forever. The sense of injustice never fully faded, but neither did the love that poured out from the community. Out of tragedy came acts of kindness, gestures of solidarity that reminded Southport that it was not alone. True crime storytelling often lingers on the darkness of the perpetrator, but the enduring story of Southport was not only about violence. It was also about bravery, of instructors who shielded children, of a businessman who ran toward danger, of children who clung to one another in fear yet survived. It was about resilience, of families who spoke out, of a town that refused to be defined only by horror. And it was about memory, of 3 young girls whose lives, though short, left indelible marks on all who knew them. As the documentary lens closes, the images that remain are not only of chaos and grief, but also of candles glowing in the dusk, of communities holding hands in silence, of parents speaking their children's names so they would never be forgotten. The Southport stabbings were an atrocity, a scar on the nation's conscience, but they also revealed the strength of ordinary people faced with the unthinkable. In that strength lay a measure of hope, that even in the shadow of violence, humanity's capacity for love, courage, and remembrance endures. In the quiet town of Luton, a family's home became the scene of unspeakable horror. A teenager's dark obsession spiraled into a brutal triple murder and a foiled school massacre. This chilling case exposes the mind of a killer and the tragedy of lives stolen far too soon. Luton, a town in Bedfordshire with its busy streets and tightly knit communities, had always been a place where everyday life unfolded without much spectacle. In September 2024, as the season shifted into autumn, families prepared their children for school and left for work, believing their homes were safe havens. Within Leabank Court, a modest block of flats, the Prosper family lived an unremarkable existence. For neighbors, Juliana Falcon was a devoted mother, someone who worked hard and kept her children close. Kyle, at 16, was a teenager balancing the pull of responsibility with the turbulence of youth. Giselle, just 13, was still in that fragile transition between childhood and adolescence, full of curiosity and promise. But beneath the surface of that ordinary household, a storm was brewing, one that would eventually shatter the illusion of safety not just for the Prosper family, but for the entire community. The source of that storm was Juliana's eldest son, 18-year-old Nicholas. He was remembered by teachers as quiet, someone who rarely caused trouble in school. Yet behind his silence lay a growing obsession. Investigators would later uncover journals filled with disturbing notes, sketches of classrooms marked with words like "kill all," and online searches that revealed a fixation on mass shootings. He was not merely fascinated by violence. He aspired to participate in it, to write his own bloody chapter in the annals of notoriety. Nicholas had studied the Columbine killers, the Sandy Hook massacre, and countless other tragedies. To him, they were not warnings but inspirations. He wanted to eclipse them, to ensure his name would echo long after his death. At home, signs of his growing detachment were subtle but real. He spent long hours isolated in his room, glued to his computer. He withdrew from the family, avoided shared meals, and rarely engaged in conversation. Juliana noticed, as any mother would, but she assumed it was the typical distance of a teenager struggling with identity. She had no idea her son was already planning her death, and the deaths of her other 2 children. To Nicholas, they were obstacles, loose ends to tie up before he moved on to his ultimate target. The children and staff of St. Joseph's Catholic Primary School, the place where he had once sat as an innocent pupil. The planning was meticulous. Nicholas forged paperwork to obtain a 12-gauge shotgun, slipping through the cracks of a system designed to prevent exactly that kind of abuse. He learned how to handle the weapon, how to load and unload cartridges, and he paired it with knives to ensure no resistance slowed him down. By September, his arsenal was ready. In his mind, timing was everything. The murders at home had to occur in silence, before dawn, giving him the cover of darkness to move undetected toward the school. Each step was mapped out, each contingency considered. He was not acting in sudden rage or impulse. He was calculating, cold and determined. In the early hours of September 13th, while the neighborhood slept under the weight of night, Nicholas set his plan into motion. The clock had barely touched 5 when he moved through the flat with his weapons. He was dressed in dark clothing, his movements deliberate. His first objective was simple: eliminate his family before they could raise an alarm. If they died quietly, he could move on seamlessly to the school, where he intended to unleash carnage on dozens of unsuspecting children and teachers. The thought thrilled him. His journals would later describe a fantasy of standing above the chaos, watching panic unfold, and basking in the infamy he so desperately craved. But reality rarely conforms to the perfection of fantasy. His mother stirred. Perhaps it was the creak of the floorboards, or the metallic click of the shotgun. But Juliana awoke to the presence of her son armed and ready to kill. In that instant, instinct took over. She confronted him, her voice raised in alarm. The confrontation derailed his plan for quiet execution. Neighbors would later recall hearing muffled shouts, hurried footsteps, and the sounds of struggle echoing through the thin walls of Leabank Court. The family was awake, and the silence Nicholas counted on was gone. Juliana fought with the desperation of a mother protecting her children. She tried to wrestle the weapon away, but Nicholas had the advantage. A single blast from the shotgun tore through her, ending her life almost instantly. Blood marked the beginning of the massacre he had envisioned, but it was far messier, louder, and more chaotic than he intended. Cal rushed into the chaos, confronted by the horrifying sight of his mother on the floor. He tried to resist, but Nicholas was merciless. After firing upon his brother, he unleashed a frenzy of knife attacks, stabbing him over 100 times. The brutality spoke not of necessity, but of rage and control. Forensic experts would later say that such overkill suggested deep-seated aggression, an urge to obliterate rather than simply silence. Giselle, the youngest, tried to escape. Terrified, she crawled beneath a dining table, hoping to hide. But Nicholas sought her out. The shotgun roared again, and a single shot to her face ended her life instantly. In mere minutes, 3 lives were extinguished. The flat, once filled with ordinary family routines, was transformed into a scene of unimaginable horror. Blood soaked the carpets, walls bore the marks of violence, and silence finally fell. Not the silence Nicholas wanted, but the silence of death. Yet Nicholas was far from finished. He packed his bag with cartridges, over 30 rounds, and prepared to move toward the school. This was to be his true performance, the stage for his twisted ambition. But outside the walls of the flat, the world was already stirring. The noise of the struggle had carried. Neighbors had dialed the police. The timeline he had so carefully orchestrated was collapsing around him. Every minute wasted in the flat was a minute closer to discovery. His plan for a grand massacre was slipping away. As dawn broke over Luton, police began to converge on Leabank Court. Nicholas, realizing his path was closing, fled the flat. He discarded the shotgun in a bush nearby and wandered the streets, calculating his next move. For 2 hours he remained adrift, the weight of his ambition clashing with the reality of failure. Finally, in a moment that baffled even seasoned investigators, he flagged down a police car. The teenager who had slaughtered his family and planned to slaughter many more presented himself to the very authority he despised. Officers arrested him swiftly, and with his arrest came the discovery of the discarded weapon, the cartridges, and the chilling evidence of what might have been. The investigation that followed would unearth the true depth of his planning. Journals revealed not only the details of the attack, but also his fantasies of posthumous fame. His computer history painted the portrait of a young man lost in violent echo chambers online, and his drawings showed classrooms marked for slaughter. This was not the act of sudden madness. This was the ambition of someone who wanted to be remembered through destruction. The Prosper family's lives had ended in silence and bloodshed, but the story was far from over. The courts would soon dissect Nicholas's mind, laying bare his motives, his disorders, and his obsession with infamy. For the town of Luton, and for a nation shaken by the near miss of a school massacre, the case became not just a tragedy, but a chilling reminder of how ordinary streets can conceal extraordinary danger. The arrest of Nicholas Prosper marked the beginning of a complex investigation that would grip the nation. When officers took him into custody, they were confronted not with a panicked teenager or a remorseful son, but with a calm and composed young man who seemed almost detached from the reality of his actions. He showed little sign of shock, no tears, no outward expressions of regret. For detectives, that absence of emotion was almost as chilling as the crime itself. They knew immediately that this was not a case of spontaneous violence or domestic dispute. It was something deeper, darker, and carefully orchestrated. Back at the crime scene, investigators walked into what one officer later described as a nightmare frozen in time. The flat was drenched in blood. Juliana lay where she had fallen, her defensive wounds etched into her body as proof of her desperate struggle. Kyle's body bore the grotesque evidence of over 100 stab wounds, a level of brutality that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend. And Giselle, the youngest, was found under the table, her small frame reduced to silence by a single shot. The scale of the violence suggested not only premeditation but an intent to utterly destroy. It was not enough for Nicholas to kill. He had needed to obliterate the people closest to him before he turned his sights on strangers. In those first few hours, the investigation moved quickly. Forensic teams scoured the flat for fingerprints, DNA traces, and ballistic evidence. Outside, search teams recovered the discarded shotgun and the stash of cartridges hidden in bushes. These discoveries would later prove critical, not only in linking Nicholas to the murders but also in revealing the extent of his planned massacre. Officers pieced together the chilling reality. Had he not been interrupted by the struggle with his mother and the alert neighbors, Nicholas might have walked into a school that morning with enough ammunition to end dozens of lives. As news spread, the community of Luton was engulfed by shock and grief. Parents who sent their children to St. Joseph's Catholic Primary School hugged them tighter, struggling to comprehend how close they had come to losing them. Neighbors, still shaken by the sounds of violence that morning, described Juliana as a devoted mother who had done everything to give her children stability. They remembered Kyle as a polite boy, respectful and bright, and Giselle as playful and full of life. The idea that Nicholas, someone they had watched grow up, could commit such atrocities was almost too much to bear. The police interrogations soon revealed more than anyone had anticipated. In custody, Nicholas was matter-of-fact. He spoke openly about his fascination with mass shootings and his desire for notoriety. He admitted forging documents to obtain the shotgun. He described how he had mapped out his school attack in meticulous detail. Officers listened in disbelief as he outlined his fantasy of surpassing past killers, of being remembered as the most infamous school shooter of his time. It became clear that his family's murders were not the endgame but merely the first step. Psychologists and psychiatrists were called in to evaluate him. Their assessments painted a complex picture. Nicholas was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and there were debates about how this influenced his behavior. While the condition explained some of his social detachment and obsessive tendencies, experts also noted traits of psychopathy, a lack of empathy, shallow affect, and a cold calculation in his planning. The combination was disturbing. He was not a boy pushed into sudden madness by overwhelming stress. He was an individual who had carefully crafted a path to destruction and followed it without hesitation. Meanwhile, prosecutors began to build their case. The Crown Prosecution Service knew the evidence was overwhelming. They had the murder weapon, the forged documents, the journals filled with chilling details, and the online history that linked him to communities glorifying mass killers. They had witness statements from neighbors who heard the chaos, and forensic evidence that left no doubt about his guilt. Yet the challenge lay in presenting not just the facts of the murders, but the broader danger Nicholas posed to society. They needed the court to understand that this was more than a family tragedy. It was a narrowly averted massacre. The community braced itself for the revelations that would come out in court. For many, it was unbearable to think of what might have happened had Juliana not fought back. Had the neighbors not called police so quickly. The thought of dozens of children slaughtered in their classrooms haunted parents and teachers alike. Vigils were held for Juliana, Kyle, and Giselle, with candles lit outside Leabank Court and prayers offered at St. Joseph's. In every face was the grief of lives lost, but also the unspoken relief that Nicholas's larger plan had been thwarted. When the case reached court, the proceedings were intense and meticulous. Prosecutor Timothy Cray KC laid out the narrative with precision, describing Nicholas as a cold, calculating killer whose actions were driven solely by ambition for infamy. He presented the journals and diagrams, showing the court how Nicholas had marked classrooms with the phrase "kill all," detailing how he had forged documents to obtain the shotgun, and how he had prepared over 30 cartridges to ensure maximum casualties. The evidence was irrefutable. The defense, led by David Bentley KC, took a different approach. They did not deny the killings, for the evidence was overwhelming, but they urged the court to consider Nicholas's autism. They argued that his condition had left him socially isolated, vulnerable to harmful online influences, and consumed by obsessive thought patterns. They painted a picture of a boy who had lost his way, who had been pulled into a dark spiral by the echo chambers of the internet. But the prosecution countered that autism did not explain the sheer brutality of the murders, nor the deliberate planning, nor the relentless obsession with fame. Inside the courtroom, the contrast was stark. On one side were photographs of the victims, smiling faces frozen in time, reminders of the lives that had been taken. On the other sat Nicholas, silent and expressionless, listening to the details of his crimes without visible reaction. Witnesses described his calm manner, his chilling lack of remorse, and his unwavering focus on the idea of becoming infamous. The judge, Mrs. Justice Chimagrub, listened carefully, her face betraying little as she weighed the evidence. For the Prosper family's surviving relatives, the trial was almost unbearable. Juliana's partner, the father of the children, spoke of the devastation of losing nearly his entire family in one night. His voice trembled as he described the hole left in his life, the memories of his children, and the unimaginable pain of knowing their lives had ended at the hands of the boy they had raised. His statement moved the courtroom to silence, a silence heavy with sorrow and anger. As the days of testimony unfolded, the public followed closely, each new revelation adding to the horror. The meticulous planning, the drawings of the school, the fantasies of infamy. These details painted Nicholas not as a confused teenager, but as someone who had deliberately chosen a path of destruction. Experts debated whether his actions were the product of mental illness, neurological difference, or sheer malevolence, but for the families of the victims, the distinctions mattered little. The reality was 3 lives lost, and many more nearly stolen. When the evidence phase concluded, it was clear the court faced a monumental decision. The murders alone were horrific enough to warrant the harshest of sentences, but the planned school massacre elevated the case into something almost unprecedented in Britain. This was not just domestic violence. It was an attempt at mass murder on a scale that could have rivaled some of the darkest tragedies in modern history. The court prepared to deliver its verdict, and the weight of justice hung heavy in the air. The sentencing phase was the final act in a case that had already shaken the nation to its core. When Nicholas Prosper was brought into the dock for the last time, the air in the courtroom was heavy, not with anticipation, but with a kind of dread. Everyone present knew they were about to hear the conclusion of a story that had begun with unthinkable violence and almost spilled into catastrophic mass murder. Families clutched tissues, reporters filled their notepads, and officers who had worked the case stood silently, their expressions carved from months of exhaustion and grief. All eyes turned to Mrs. Justice Chimagrub, the judge who now carried the burden of delivering justice for Juliana, Kyle, and little Giselle. As she began, her words were slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of the crimes that had been committed. She recounted the events of that February morning, the brutal slaughter of a mother and her children, and the thwarted plan for mass carnage at a school. She described Nicholas as someone who had planned and prepared, who had left nothing to chance, and who pursued notoriety with chilling focus. In her assessment, he was not simply a troubled young man lost in fantasies, but a calculating killer who had chosen to act. Her voice cut through the silence when she declared that the murders had been committed with extraordinary cruelty, and that the planned school attack would have been an atrocity of devastating proportions. The judge imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 40 years. It was one of the harshest penalties a young offender had received in Britain in recent memory. The words life sentence reverberated through the courtroom, though for many of the grieving relatives, no punishment could ever feel proportionate to the loss. Nicholas showed no visible reaction, no tears, no plea for forgiveness. He remained motionless, his gaze fixed downward, as if disconnected from the enormity of his fate. For the families, his lack of remorse was a wound that could never heal. Outside the courtroom, the father of Kyle and Giselle gave a victim impact statement that left reporters shaken. His voice trembled as he described waking each day to the reality that his children were gone, that the laughter, the warmth, the simple joys of life had been replaced by silence. He spoke of Juliana's courage, of her desperate attempt to protect the children, and of the cruelty of watching her legacy reduced to ashes. The grief in his words was unbearable, yet he spoke them with dignity, determined that the memory of his family would not be overshadowed by the boy who had destroyed them. His pain, raw and unfiltered, became a reminder of the true cost of Nicholas's actions. In the aftermath, the case sent shockwaves far beyond Luton. Across Britain, schools reviewed their safety protocols. Parents questioned how a teenager could so easily forge documents to obtain a firearm. Politicians debated the influence of online spaces that glorify killers, and mental health advocates urged a deeper look into how vulnerable young people are drawn into destructive ideologies. Forensic psychologists gave interviews, warning that Nicholas was not an isolated case but part of a wider pattern of radicalization through the internet, where obsession with mass violence feeds on itself in hidden corners of forums and chat rooms. The tragedy also reopened difficult conversations about autism, criminal responsibility, and the justice system. While some argued that Nicholas's diagnosis had been exploited as a shield during trial, others stressed the need to separate neurodiversity from deliberate acts of violence. Advocacy groups spoke passionately against stigmatizing autism, pointing out that millions live peaceful, fulfilling lives, and that Nicholas's crime was the product of his own choices, not his condition. The debate was messy, painful, and necessary. It revealed society's struggle to balance compassion with accountability, understanding with justice. As journalists pieced together the story, they painted a portrait of Nicholas's descent into darkness. Accounts from his schoolmates revealed a boy who was intelligent but withdrawn, fascinated by violent ideologies, and drawn increasingly to the grim world of online forums that romanticized killers. Teachers recalled a student who was difficult to reach, yet never gave clear signs of the horror he was planning. In hindsight, the warning signs seemed scattered: comments made about shootings abroad, an obsession with violent video content, a growing detachment from peers. But none of these fragments had been enough to predict the scale of what he was capable of. In the community of Luton, scars remained deep. Leabank Court became a place of mourning, with flowers laid at the gates and candles lit long after the trial had ended. St. Joseph's Catholic Primary School, the target of Nicholas's planned attack, became a site of quiet gratitude and lingering fear. Parents would forever remember how narrowly their children had escaped the fate he had designed for them. Some could not shake the haunting thought: had Juliana not fought back, had the police not intervened so quickly, Dozens of young lives might have been lost. That sense of a disaster barely averted became part of the town's collective memory. For those who worked on the case, the experience left an indelible mark. Detectives spoke privately of their difficulty processing the brutality they had witnessed. Seasoned officers who had faced countless murders admitted that this case, with its blend of familial betrayal and near-catastrophic mass murder, would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Prosecutors described the trial as one of the most emotionally demanding of their lives, balancing the need to present Nicholas's condition fairly while ensuring the court saw the calculated cruelty of his acts. Even journalists confessed to sleepless nights, their minds unable to shake the images of a young boy stabbing his brother more than 100 times. As the years stretched forward, questions remained unanswered. Why had Nicholas become so consumed with infamy? What combination of personal psychology, online influence, and inner darkness had pushed him to transform fantasy into reality? Experts debated endlessly, but no single explanation could ever make sense of such senseless cruelty. Perhaps that was the ultimate horror of the case, that there would never be a satisfying reason, only fragments of understanding that never quite joined into a whole. In the end, the Prosper murders became a grim chapter in Britain's modern history, a case that reminded the nation of the fragility of safety, the depths of human darkness, and the courage of those who fight, even in their final moments, to protect others. Juliana's last struggle against her son may have been in vain for her and her children, but it was also the act that disrupted his plan, the resistance that prevented him from carrying out his massacre. In her death, she saved countless other lives, and that act of defiance remains her legacy. The story closed with Nicholas locked away, his dream of notoriety twisted into infamy of a different kind. For him, there would be no glory, no celebration in the halls of those he idolized. Instead, there was only silence, a prison cell, and the memory of what he had destroyed. For the rest of the world, there was the task of remembering the victims not as numbers in a headline, but as people: Juliana, the protective mother; Kyle, the bright and respectful boy; and Giselle, the playful child whose life had barely begun. Their names, spoken at vigils, printed in newspapers, etched into memory, became the only light left in the shadow of Nicholas's crime. And so the case ended where it had begun, not with the killer, but with the family he destroyed. Their story, told in photographs and memories, in court statements and vigils, lived on as a reminder of the devastation violence leaves behind, and of the lives that deserve to be remembered far more than the boy who tried to erase them.